Sarah Martinez walked through the gleaming marble lobby of Pinnacle Financial Services, her heels clicking against the polished floor. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the busy entrance hall. She clutched her coffee cup tighter, feeling the familiar knot in her stomach that had been her constant companion for the past 6 months. At 28, Sarah had worked her way up to senior marketing coordinator at one of the city's most prestigious financial firms. Her corner office on the 15th floor was a testament to her dedication and skill, but lately, the corporate environment felt more suffocating than rewarding. The culture at Pinnacle was ruthless, where success was measured solely by numbers, and human decency often took a backseat to profit margins. As she waited for the elevator, Sarah noticed Miguel Santos emptying the trash bins near the reception desk. The 62-year-old janitor had been working at Pinnacle for nearly 15 years, arriving each morning at 5 to ensure the building was spotless before the executives arrived. His weathered hands moved efficiently as he replaced the liner, his movements practiced and precise despite the early hour. Sarah had always made it a point to greet Miguel with a warm smile and genuine conversation. Unlike many of her colleagues who barely acknowledged the cleaning staff, she saw him as a human being with his own story, struggles, and dignity. Miguel had shared with her that he supported his wife who battled diabetes, and their grandson who lived with them while his parents served overseas in the military. "Buenos dias, Miguel," Sarah called out softly as she approached the elevator bank. Miguel's face brightened immediately. "Good morning, Miss Sarah. How was your weekend?" "It was good. Thank you for asking. How is Maria feeling? Is her medication helping?" The older man's eyes warmed with appreciation. In a building where most people looked through him as if he were invisible, Sarah's genuine concern meant everything. "She's doing better, gracias. The new doctor you recommended, he's been very helpful." Their conversation was interrupted by the sharp ping of the elevator arrival. As the door slid open, Sarah was dismayed to see Derek Lawson already inside. Derek was the regional sales director, a man whose reputation preceded him like a dark cloud. At 35, he had climbed the corporate ladder through a combination of aggressive tactics, strategic backstabbing, and an inflated sense of his own importance. Derek stood 6 feet tall with perfectly styled blonde hair and an expensive suit that probably cost more than Miguel made in 2 months. His cold blue eyes surveyed everything around him with the calculating gaze of a predator. He was known throughout the company for his volatile temper, his tendency to belittle subordinates, and his complete lack of empathy for anyone he deemed beneath his status. Well, Derek's voice dripped with condescension as Sarah stepped into the elevator. "If it isn't our bleeding heart marketing princess, chatting up the help again." Sarah felt her jaw tighten, but she maintained her composure. "Good morning, Derek. You know, Sarah, there's a reason why there's a hierarchy in the corporate world. Some people are meant to lead, others are meant to follow, and some," he glanced meaningfully toward Miguel, who was still visible through the closing elevator doors, "are meant to clean up after their betters." The elevator began its slow ascent, and Sarah found herself trapped in a confined space with Derek's toxic energy. She had heard rumors about his treatment of other employees, particularly those he considered beneath him. There were whispered stories of verbal abuse, deliberate humiliation, and a pattern of behavior that should have resulted in his termination long ago. However, Derek's sales numbers were impressive, and upper management seemed willing to overlook his personal failings as long as he continued to generate revenue. "Everyone deserves basic respect, Derek," Sarah replied evenly, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor numbers as they climbed. Derek laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the small space. "Respect is earned, not given. That old man is lucky to have a job at all. Do you know how easily replaceable he is? There are dozens of people who would kill for his position." Sarah felt her anger rising but forced herself to remain calm. She knew that engaging with Derek would only escalate the situation, and she had learned from experience that reasoning with someone like him was often futile. Instead, she focused on her breathing and counted the floors until she could escape his presence. The elevator stopped on the 8th floor, and Derek stepped out without another word. As the doors closed behind him, Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The encounter left her feeling unsettled, not just because of Derek's obvious disdain for Miguel, but because she recognized the pattern of behavior that often preceded more serious incidents. Sarah's office was located on the 15th floor, in a section reserved for senior staff members. Her workspace was modern and efficient, with a large window that offered a stunning view of the city skyline. Awards and certificates lined one wall, testament to her professional achievements and dedication to her craft. Despite the impressive surroundings, Sarah often felt like she was living a double life, maintaining a professional facade while struggling with her growing discomfort with the company's culture. As she settled into her chair and powered up her computer, Sarah's mind kept returning to the elevator encounter. She had witnessed Derek's behavior toward other employees before, but there was something particularly cruel about the way he had spoken about Miguel. The older man worked harder than most people half his age, took pride in his job, and treated everyone with kindness and respect. He deserved better than to be dismissed as expendable by someone who had likely never worked a day of manual labor in his privileged life. Sarah's morning was filled with the usual tasks: reviewing marketing campaigns, analyzing consumer data, and preparing presentations for upcoming client meetings. However, she found it difficult to concentrate, her thoughts repeatedly returning to the toxic dynamic she had witnessed. She knew that Derek's behavior was not just morally wrong, but also potentially illegal, creating a hostile work environment that could expose the company to serious legal liability. During her lunch break, Sarah decided to visit the building's lower levels where the maintenance staff had their break room. She often brought extra food or coffee to share with the cleaning crew, a small gesture that she hoped brightened their day. The break room was a stark contrast to the luxurious executive floors above, with fluorescent lighting, plastic chairs, and an ancient coffee machine that barely worked. Miguel was there, along with several other maintenance workers, eating a simple sandwich and reading a Spanish-language newspaper. His face lit up when he saw Sarah enter with a box of pastries from the upscale bakery across the street. "Miss Sarah, you spoil us," he said with a genuine smile as she placed the box on the small table. "It's nothing," Sarah replied, settling into one of the plastic chairs. "I just wanted to see how everyone was doing." The conversation flowed easily, with Miguel and his colleagues sharing stories about their families, their hopes for the future, and their gratitude for steady employment. Sarah was struck by their positive attitudes despite the challenges they faced, including low wages, long hours, and the occasional disrespectful treatment from some of the white-collar employees. "Miguel," Sarah said carefully, "has anyone been giving you trouble lately? I know some people in this building don't always treat the staff with the respect you deserve." Miguel's expression grew thoughtful. "There are always some difficult people, but mostly everyone is fine." "Why do you ask?" Sarah hesitated, unsure of how much to share about her encounter with Derek. "I just want to make sure you feel comfortable coming to work each day. If anyone ever makes you feel unwelcome or treats you poorly, you should know that you have options." The older man nodded slowly. "I appreciate your concern, Miss Sarah. I've been working here for many years, and I've learned to handle difficult situations. But it's nice to know that someone cares." As Sarah returned to her office, she felt a growing sense of responsibility. She had witnessed firsthand the kind of person Derek was, and she suspected that his behavior toward Miguel and other staff members would only escalate if left unchecked. The question was what, if anything, she should do about it. The afternoon passed quickly, with Sarah attending several meetings and working on a major presentation for a potential new client. As the workday wound down, she found herself staying late to finish a project, a common occurrence in her demanding role. The office gradually emptied as her colleagues headed home to their families and evening activities. Around 7 o'clock, Sarah heard the sound of a vacuum cleaner in the hallway outside her office. She looked up from her computer screen to see Miguel working methodically, ensuring that every corner was spotless for the next day. His dedication was evident in the careful attention he paid to each detail, from emptying waste baskets to wiping down surfaces with antiseptic solution. Sarah gathered her things and prepared to leave, but as she walked toward the elevator bank, she heard raised voices coming from the direction of Derek's office. She paused, recognizing Derek's aggressive tone even through the closed door. Her heart sank as she realized that Miguel was likely the target of whatever tirade was taking place. The voices grew louder, and Sarah found herself moving closer to Derek's office, her concern for Miguel overriding her usual reluctance to get involved in workplace conflicts. Through the partially open door, she could see Derek standing over Miguel, who was holding a cleaning cloth and looking visibly shaken. "I specifically told you not to touch anything on my desk," Derek was saying, his voice filled with barely controlled rage. "Do you have any idea how important those documents are? Your carelessness could have cost us thousands of dollars." Miguel's voice was quiet but steady. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Lawson. I was only trying to dust around the papers, not move them. I'll be more careful in the future." "More careful?" Derek's voice rose another octave. "You people are all the same. No attention to detail, no respect for other people's property. Maybe it's time we found someone who actually understands the value of precision." Sarah felt her anger flare. She knew Derek well enough to recognize that this was likely a manufactured crisis, an excuse to berate and humiliate Miguel for his own twisted satisfaction. The older man had been cleaning offices for 15 years without incident, and his work was consistently praised by building management. "Please, Mr. Lawson," Miguel said, his dignity intact despite the verbal assault. "I take my job very seriously. If I made a mistake, I will make sure it doesn't happen again." Derek stepped closer to Miguel, using his height and position to intimidate the older man. "Your job? Your job is to be invisible, to clean up, and disappear without bothering the people who actually matter. Maybe you've forgotten your place in the hierarchy." The cruel words hit their target, and Sarah saw Miguel's shoulders sag slightly. This was more than just a reprimand about cleaning procedures. This was a deliberate attempt to dehumanize and belittle a good man who deserved better treatment. Sarah realized she was at a crossroads. She could walk away, pretend she hadn't witnessed the interaction, and go home to her comfortable apartment where she could try to forget about the injustice she had seen. Alternatively, she could step forward and confront a situation that was clearly wrong, knowing that such action might have serious consequences for her own career. The decision was easier than she had expected. Some things were more important than job security or corporate politics. Sarah took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and prepared to enter Derek's office. She had no idea that this moment would change everything, setting in motion a chain of events that would test her courage, challenge her principles, and ultimately define the kind of person she chose to be. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she knocked on Derek's office door frame. Both men turned to look at her, Derek's face immediately darkening with annoyance while Miguel's expression showed a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Sarah said, stepping into the office despite not being invited. "I couldn't help but overhear the conversation, and I think there might be a misunderstanding." Derek's eyes narrowed as he assessed this unexpected intrusion. "This is a private conversation, Sarah. I suggest you continue on your way home." "Actually, I don't think it is private when it involves workplace harassment," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. She had crossed the line now, and there was no going back. "Miguel has been nothing but professional and dedicated in his 15 years here. Whatever happened with your desk, I'm sure it was completely accidental." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Derek processed Sarah's words. He was clearly unaccustomed to being challenged, especially by someone he viewed as inferior in the corporate hierarchy. His face flushed red, and the vein in his temple began to throb visibly. "Are you questioning my judgment?" Derek asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Because last I checked, I outrank you significantly in this company." Miguel shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing he could disappear from the increasingly tense situation. "Miss Sarah, please, it's okay. Mr. Lawson and I were just discussing proper cleaning procedures." Sarah turned to Miguel with compassion in her eyes. "No, Miguel, it's not okay. Everyone deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of their job title or position in the company." Derek laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Respect? You want to talk about respect? I'll tell you what's disrespectful. Having some bleeding heart do-gooder interrupt a perfectly reasonable conversation between a supervisor and an employee who clearly can't follow simple instructions." "What's disrespectful," Sarah shot back, "is using your position to intimidate and belittle someone who works harder than most people in this building. Miguel takes pride in his work, and he doesn't deserve to be treated like he's disposable." The confrontation was escalating quickly, and Sarah could see that Derek was becoming increasingly agitated. She knew she was taking a significant risk by challenging him so directly, but she couldn't stand by and watch him continue to abuse his power. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Derek snarled. "This old man is lucky to have any job at all. Do you know how many younger, stronger people would love to take his place? He should be grateful for the opportunity to work for a company like Pinnacle." Sarah felt her anger rising at the callous dismissal of Miguel's worth as a human being. Miguel isn't just an old man. He's a dedicated employee who has given 15 years of loyal service to this company. He supports his family, pays his taxes, and treats everyone with kindness and respect. If anyone should be grateful, it's the company for having someone so reliable and hardworking. Derek stepped closer to Sarah, attempting to use the same intimidation tactics he had employed with Miguel. "You're way out of line, Martinez. I suggest you walk out of here right now and forget this conversation ever happened. Otherwise, I might have to have a discussion with HR about your inability to understand proper workplace boundaries." "Go ahead," Sarah replied, standing her ground despite Derek's threatening posture. "I'd be happy to discuss workplace boundaries with HR. We could talk about creating a hostile work environment, verbal harassment, and the company's liability when supervisors abuse their authority." Miguel looked back and forth between the two, clearly distressed by the conflict he had inadvertently caused. "Please, both of you, this is not necessary. I can handle my own problems." Sarah turned to Miguel with a gentle but firm expression. "You shouldn't have to handle problems that aren't really problems at all. You were doing your job, and doing it well. No one should have to tolerate being spoken to the way you were being spoken to." Derek's patience finally snapped completely. "That's it. I don't have to listen to this sanctimonious garbage from some mid-level marketing coordinator who thinks she knows how to run a business. You want to defend the help? Fine. But don't expect it to go unnoticed by the people who actually matter in this company." "The people who actually matter?" Sarah repeated, her voice rising with indignation. "Every person who works in this building matters. Miguel matters just as much as you do, despite what your inflated ego might tell you." "My inflated ego?" Derek's voice reached a crescendo as he completely lost control. "I'll show you inflated ego, you self-righteous little." Derek raised his hand as if to strike Sarah, his face contorted with rage. For a moment, the office fell completely silent except for the sound of heavy breathing. Miguel gasped audibly, moving instinctively to step between Derek and Sarah, despite being significantly older and smaller than the enraged executive. The moment stretched on for what seemed like an eternity. Derek's hand remained raised, trembling with fury, while Sarah stood perfectly still, her chin raised defiantly. She refused to flinch or show any sign of fear. Even though her heart was pounding so hard, she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. "Mr. Lawson," Miguel said quietly but firmly, "please don't do anything you'll regret." Miss Sarah was only trying to help. Derek seemed to realize suddenly where he was and what he was about to do. His hand slowly dropped to his side, but the murderous look in his eyes remained. "Get out," he said through gritted teeth. "Both of you, get out of my office right now." Sarah and Miguel quickly gathered themselves and moved toward the door, but Derek wasn't finished. "This isn't over, Martinez. Not by a long shot. You have no idea who you're messing with." As they walked out into the hallway, Sarah's legs felt weak with adrenaline and delayed shock. She had never been in such a volatile confrontation before, and the realization that Derek had almost struck her was just beginning to sink in. Miguel gently took her arm, guiding her away from Derek's office toward the elevator bank. "Miss Sarah, I'm so sorry you got involved in that," Miguel said once they were safely away from Derek's office. "I never wanted anyone to get in trouble because of me." Sarah shook her head, trying to process what had just happened. "You have nothing to apologize for, Miguel." Derek's behavior was completely unacceptable, and someone needed to speak up. The elevator arrived, and they rode down in relative silence, both lost in their own thoughts about the confrontation and its potential consequences. When they reached the lobby, Miguel turned to Sarah with genuine concern in his eyes. "What will you do now?" Mr. Lawson seemed very angry. Sarah considered the question carefully. She knew that Derek would likely try to retaliate against her professionally, and she also knew that his threat about involving HR was probably not an empty one. However, she also knew that she had done the right thing, and She wasn't willing to let Derek's intimidation tactics silence her. "I'm going to document what happened and report it to HR myself," Sarah said finally. "Derek's behavior tonight crossed several lines, and the company needs to know about it." Miguel nodded thoughtfully. "You are very brave, Miss Sarah. I hope nothing bad happens to you because of this." As Sarah drove home that evening, her mind was racing with thoughts about the confrontation and its aftermath. She knew that challenging Derek so directly had been risky, but she couldn't regret standing up for Miguel. The older man had dedicated 15 years of his life to the company, and he deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. Sarah's apartment was a modest but comfortable space in a quiet neighborhood about 20 minutes from downtown. She had purchased it 2 years earlier, proud to achieve the milestone of homeownership through her hard work and careful financial planning. As she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, she began writing a detailed account of the evening's events. The report was meticulous and professional, documenting not only the immediate confrontation, but also the pattern of behavior she had observed from Derek over the months she had worked at Pinnacle. She included specific dates and incidents where possible, focusing on factual observations rather than emotional reactions. As she wrote, Sarah reflected on the broader implications of what had happened. Derek's behavior toward Miguel was symptomatic of a larger cultural problem within the company, where certain employees were valued based solely on their perceived importance to the bottom line, while others were treated as expendable resources. The next morning, Sarah arrived at work early and went directly to the HR department. Patricia Williams, the director of human resources, was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had built a reputation for fairness and professionalism during her 10 years with the company. "I need to file a formal complaint about a serious incident that occurred last night," Sarah said as she handed over her detailed report. Patricia read through the document carefully, her expression growing increasingly serious as she absorbed the details of Derek's behavior. When she finished reading, she looked up at Sarah with a mixture of concern and professional determination. "These are very serious allegations," Patricia said. "If what you're describing is accurate, Derek's behavior violated several company policies, not to mention potentially exposing us to significant legal liability." Sarah nodded. "I understand the gravity of the situation. That's why I felt it was important to document everything thoroughly and report it immediately. I appreciate you coming forward with this," Patricia continued. "However, I need to warn you that Derek will likely deny these allegations, and the investigation process can be difficult for everyone involved." "I understand," Sarah replied. "But Miguel doesn't deserve to be treated the way Derek treated him, and I'm willing to face whatever consequences come from standing up for what's right." Patricia made several notes in Sarah's file and assured her that a thorough investigation would be conducted. She also warned Sarah to be prepared for potential retaliation attempts from Derek, and advised her to document any unusual interactions or treatment from that point forward. As Sarah returned to her office, she felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She had taken the first step in holding Derek accountable for his actions, but she knew that the real battle was just beginning. Derek was well connected within the company and had significant influence with upper management. He wouldn't go down without a fight. Throughout the day, Sarah noticed several of her colleagues giving her strange looks, and she suspected that word of the confrontation was already beginning to spread through the office gossip network. By lunchtime, several people had approached her with vague questions about what happened last night, but Sarah politely deflected their inquiries, knowing that discussing the situation publicly could compromise the HR investigation. Derek, for his part, seemed to be going about his normal routine, although Sarah noticed that he made a point of walking past her office several times throughout the day, each time fixing her with a cold stare that made her skin crawl. She documented each incident, adding to the growing file of evidence that she hoped would support her case. As the workday drew to a close, Sarah received an email requesting her presence in the HR office first thing the following morning for a formal interview about her complaint. She knew that this was the beginning of a process that could take weeks or even months to resolve, and she steeled herself for the challenges ahead. That evening, Sarah called her sister Elena, who lived across the country but had always been her closest confidant and strongest supporter. Elena listened carefully as Sarah recounted the events of the previous night and the steps she had taken that day. I'm proud of you, Elena said when Sarah finished her story. It takes real courage to stand up to someone like that, especially when your job could be at risk. I keep second-guessing myself, Sarah admitted. Maybe I should have just walked away or found a more diplomatic way to handle the situation. No, Elena said firmly. You did exactly the right thing. That man was abusing his power and humiliating someone who couldn't defend himself. If good people don't speak up in situations like that, who will? As Sarah prepared for bed that night, she thought about Elena's words and felt a renewed sense of conviction about her decision. She knew that the coming days and weeks would be challenging, but she also knew that she couldn't live with herself if she had remained silent while Derek continued to abuse and intimidate Miguel and potentially other vulnerable employees. Little did Sarah know that Derek was already planning his revenge, and that the confrontation in his office was only the beginning of a much larger battle that would test not only her professional resilience, but also her physical courage in ways she never could have imagined. The formal HR interview took place in a sterile conference room on the third floor, its beige walls and fluorescent lighting creating an atmosphere that felt more like an interrogation than a supportive environment for reporting misconduct. Sarah sat across from Patricia Williams and James Foster, the company's legal counsel, both of whom maintained professionally neutral expressions as they reviewed her written statement. We've read your report thoroughly, Patricia began, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses. Before we proceed with the investigation, we need to ask you some additional questions to ensure we have a complete understanding of the situation. For the next hour, Sarah fielded detailed questions about every aspect of the confrontation, from the exact words Derek had used to the positioning of everyone in the room when he had raised his hand toward her. She answered each question as precisely as possible, drawing on the detailed notes she had made immediately after the incident. James Foster leaned forward, his expression thoughtful but cautious. Ms. Martinez, you understand that these are very serious allegations. Workplace harassment and threatening behavior are matters that the company takes extremely seriously, but we also need to be thorough in our investigation to ensure fairness for all parties involved. Sarah nodded. I understand completely. I wouldn't have come forward if I wasn't certain about what I witnessed and experienced. We'll be interviewing Miguel Santos as well, Patricia added. Given that he was the target of the alleged harassment, his testimony will be crucial to our investigation. As Sarah left the conference room, she felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. She had done everything she could to present her case clearly and professionally, but she knew that the real test would come when Derek was called in to give his version of events. The rest of the week passed in an uncomfortable fog of tension and uncertainty. Sarah noticed that several of her colleagues seemed to be avoiding her, their conversations stopping abruptly when she approached. The office gossip mill was clearly working overtime, and she suspected that various versions of the story were circulating throughout the building. Miguel, for his part, seemed nervous and withdrawn. Sarah occasionally saw him in the hallways, but their interactions were limited to brief, polite greetings. She understood that he was probably feeling overwhelmed by the situation and didn't want to make things more difficult for him by drawing additional attention to their relationship. Derek, meanwhile, appeared to be conducting business as usual, though Sarah noticed that he seemed to be making more of an effort to be visible around the office. He attended meetings he normally would have skipped, spent more time in common areas, and made a point of engaging in friendly conversations with senior management. Sarah suspected that he was working to shore up his support network in preparation for the investigation. On Friday afternoon, Sarah received a call from Patricia requesting another meeting. This time, however, the tone was markedly different from their previous interaction. We've completed our initial interviews, Patricia said, her expression carefully controlled. Derek has provided his version of events, which differs significantly from your account. Sarah felt her stomach clench with apprehension. In what way? According to Derek, the interaction with Miguel was a routine performance review that became heated when you interrupted inappropriately. He claims that he never raised his hand toward you, and that you misinterpreted his gestures as threatening when he was simply emphasizing a point during the conversation. That's not what happened, Sarah said firmly. Derek was verbally abusing Miguel, and he absolutely raised his hand as if to strike me when I challenged his behavior. Patricia nodded. We understand your position. However, Miguel's account of the events is somewhat ambiguous. He confirms that Derek was upset about a cleaning incident, but he doesn't recall Derek raising his hand toward you. He says he was focused on trying to defuse the situation and may not have seen everything clearly. Sarah's heart sank. She understood Miguel's position. He was afraid of losing his job and probably felt that minimizing the incident was his safest option. She couldn't blame him for being cautious, but his reluctance to fully corroborate her story significantly weakened her case. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. James Foster cleared his throat. "Given the conflicting accounts and the lack of independent witnesses, we're going to continue our investigation. However, I need to advise you that making false accusations against a colleague is a serious matter that could result in disciplinary action." The implied threat was clear, and Sarah felt a surge of anger at the way the situation was being handled. "Are you suggesting that I'm lying?" "Not at all," Patricia said quickly. "We're simply explaining the company's position on false accusations to ensure that everyone understands the potential consequences of this process." As Sarah left the meeting, she felt deflated and frustrated. She had expected the investigation to be challenging, but she hadn't anticipated that her own credibility would be called into question so quickly. She knew that Derek was a skilled manipulator who had probably presented himself as the victim of an overzealous employee with a misguided sense of justice. The following Monday brought new challenges. Sarah arrived at work to find that several of her ongoing projects had been reassigned to other team members without explanation. When she asked her immediate supervisor about the changes, she was told that upper management felt it would be better to distribute the workload more evenly. Over the next few days, the professional isolation continued to intensify. Sarah found herself excluded from meetings she normally would have attended, and her input was no longer sought on decisions that fell within her area of expertise. It became clear that Derek was using his influence within the company to systematically undermine her position. The psychological pressure was immense. Sarah began to second-guess every decision she made, wondering if her colleagues viewed her as a troublemaker who had disrupted the workplace harmony. She started eating lunch alone, avoiding the common areas where she might encounter Derek or his allies. One evening, as Sarah was working late to complete a project that should have had more resources allocated to it, she heard footsteps approaching her office. She looked up to see Derek standing in her doorway, his expression unreadable in the dim lighting of the mostly empty floor. "Working late again, Sarah?" Derek said, his tone deceptively casual. "That's dedication to the company. I admire that." Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but she maintained her composure. "Just finishing up some work." "What can I do for you, Derek?" Derek stepped into her office uninvited and closed the door behind him. The sound of the door clicking shut sent a chill down Sarah's spine, and she became acutely aware that they were alone on the floor with no one around to witness whatever Derek had planned. "I wanted to have a private conversation with you," Derek said, settling into the chair across from her desk as if he had been invited. "About this unfortunate misunderstanding we had last week." "I don't think there was any misunderstanding," Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady despite her growing unease. "I reported what I witnessed, and the HR department is handling the investigation." Derek smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "The HR investigation, yes. I think we both know how that's going to turn out. Your word against mine, with no corroborating witnesses. In a situation like that, the company tends to side with the employee who brings in more revenue." Sarah said nothing, recognizing that Derek was trying to bait her into an argument. She kept her hands visible on her desk and made mental notes about everything he was saying, knowing that this conversation might become relevant to the ongoing investigation. "I'm a reasonable man, Sarah," Derek continued, leaning back in the chair as if he were completely relaxed. "I'm willing to put this whole incident behind us if you're willing to be reasonable as well." "What do you mean by reasonable?" Sarah asked. "I mean admitting that you may have misinterpreted what you saw that evening. People see things differently when they're emotional, and it's understandable that you might have gotten the wrong impression about a perfectly normal workplace interaction." Derek's voice remained calm and measured, but Sarah could see the predatory gleam in his eyes. He was enjoying the power dynamic, the fact that he could sit in her office and essentially threaten her job with impunity. "I know what I saw," Sarah said firmly, "and I won't change my statement to HR." Derek's expression hardened slightly. That's unfortunate. I was hoping we could resolve this like adults. But if you insist on pursuing this vendetta against me, then I'm afraid the consequences will be entirely your responsibility. Is that a threat? Sarah asked. It's a reality check, Derek replied. You're a mid-level employee with no real allies in upper management. I'm a senior executive who has generated millions of dollars in revenue for this company. Who do you think the board will support if this situation escalates? Derek stood up and moved toward the door, but he paused with his hand on the handle. I'll give you one more chance to reconsider your position, Sarah. Think carefully about whether this crusade of yours is really worth your career. After Derek left, Sarah sat in her office feeling shaken and angry. The encounter had been a clear attempt at intimidation, and she knew that she should document it immediately. However, she also knew that Derek had been careful not to make any explicit threats that could be used against him in a formal proceeding. As she gathered her things to leave, Sarah realized that the situation was escalating beyond a simple HR complaint. Derek was not going to accept defeat gracefully, and she suspected that his retaliation would become more aggressive as the investigation continued. The following week brought additional challenges. Sarah discovered that her access to certain company databases had been revoked without explanation, making it nearly impossible for her to complete her assigned tasks. When she complained to her supervisor, she was told that security protocols were being updated and that her access would be restored when appropriate. Meanwhile, Derek seemed to be everywhere, attending meetings, socializing with colleagues, and generally maintaining a high profile within the company. Sarah began to suspect that he was working systematically to build support for himself while isolating her from potential allies. The psychological warfare was taking its toll. Sarah found herself sleeping poorly, constantly looking over her shoulder, and questioning every interaction with her colleagues. She began to wonder if pursuing the complaint had been a mistake, and whether she should have simply walked away from the confrontation with Derek and Miguel. However, every time she considered withdrawing her complaint, she thought about Miguel and the dignity with which he had endured Derek's abuse. She knew that if she backed down now, Derek would be emboldened to continue his pattern of harassment, potentially targeting other vulnerable employees who lacked the resources to defend themselves. 2 weeks after her initial complaint, Sarah received another call from HR. This time, however, the news was even more discouraging. Patricia explained that the investigation had been expanded to include Sarah's pattern of insubordination and unprofessional behavior. What pattern? Sarah asked, genuinely confused. Several employees have come forward with concerns about your attitude and performance, Patricia explained. There are allegations that you've been disruptive in meetings, uncooperative with colleagues, and generally difficult to work with. Sarah realized immediately what was happening. Derek had orchestrated a campaign to discredit her, using his influence and relationships within the company to create a false narrative about her professional behavior. The employees who had come forward were likely people who owed their positions or advancement to Derek's support. This is retaliation for my complaint against Derek, Sarah said. He's using his position to turn people against me. That's a serious allegation, James Foster interjected. Do you have any evidence to support that claim? Sarah struggled to find concrete proof of Derek's campaign against her. The isolation and professional sabotage she had experienced were real, but proving that Derek was orchestrating it would be nearly impossible without access to private communications or willingness from other employees to testify against him. As Sarah left the HR office for what she suspected might be the last time, she realized that she was fighting a battle she couldn't win through official channels. Derek had too much power and influence within the company, and the system was designed to protect valuable revenue generators rather than employees who rocked the boat. However, Sarah also knew that she couldn't simply accept defeat and allow Derek to continue his pattern of abuse. If the company wouldn't hold him accountable through proper channels, then perhaps it was time to consider other options. That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment researching employment lawyers and considering her next steps. She knew that pursuing legal action would be expensive, time-consuming, and potentially career-ending, but she was beginning to realize that her career at Pinnacle was probably over regardless of what she did. As she reviewed her options, Sarah's phone rang. The caller ID showed Miguel's name, and she answered quickly, concerned that something might have happened to him. Miss Sarah, Miguel's voice was barely above a whisper. I'm sorry to call you at home, but I needed to tell you something important. I think Mr. Lawson is planning something bad. I overheard him talking to someone on the phone about teaching you a lesson. Sarah's blood ran cold. What exactly did you hear, Miguel? I don't know all the details, but he was angry, very angry. He said something about making sure you understand your place. I'm scared for you, Miss Sarah. I think you should be very careful. As Sarah hung up the phone, she realized that her conflict with Derek was about to enter a new and potentially dangerous phase. The corporate retaliation had been difficult to endure, but the possibility of physical confrontation was something she had never seriously considered. She spent a sleepless night wondering what Derek might be planning and whether she was prepared for whatever came next. She had stood up for Miguel because it was the right thing to do, but she was beginning to understand that doing the right thing sometimes came with consequences that were far more serious than she had ever imagined. The company's annual awards banquet was scheduled for Friday evening at the Grand Ballroom of the downtown Marriott. It was the kind of corporate event that everyone was expected to attend, a mixture of genuine celebration and mandatory networking where promotions were announced and company loyalty was publicly displayed. Sarah had considered skipping the event entirely, given the ongoing tension with Derek and the increasingly hostile work environment. However, she ultimately decided that avoiding the banquet would only give Derek and his supporters more ammunition to use against her. She was determined not to let intimidation tactics drive her into hiding. The ballroom was elegantly decorated with the company's colors, and round tables filled the space, each accommodating 8 employees from various departments. Sarah arrived fashionably late, hoping to avoid unnecessary small talk and awkward encounters. She had chosen a professional black dress that was both appropriate for the formal event and practical enough to allow for quick movement if necessary. As she entered the ballroom, Sarah immediately spotted Derek holding court at a prominent table near the front of the room. He was surrounded by several senior executives and their spouses, regaling them with what appeared to be an amusing story based on the laughter emanating from the group. He looked completely at ease, showing no signs of stress or concern about the ongoing HR investigation. Sarah made her way to a table toward the back of the room, where she was pleased to find several colleagues from other departments who had maintained friendly relationships with her despite the recent tensions. The conversation at her table was light and professional, focusing on upcoming projects and industry trends rather than office politics. About halfway through the dinner service, Sarah excused herself to visit the restroom. As she walked through the hotel's ornate lobby, she was surprised to encounter Miguel, dressed in his best suit and looking somewhat uncomfortable in the formal surroundings. Miguel, I didn't expect to see you here, Sarah said, genuinely pleased to see a friendly face. Miguel smiled nervously. The cleaning staff was invited to attend this year. Mr. Peterson thought it would be good for company morale to include everyone. I almost didn't come, but my wife convinced me it would be important to show respect for the company. Sarah was touched by Miguel's dedication, even after everything he had endured. I'm glad you came. You've earned the right to be here just as much as anyone else. As they chatted, Sarah noticed Derek approaching from across the lobby. Her pulse quickened, and she instinctively moved closer to Miguel, unsure of what Derek might do in such a public setting. Well, Derek's voice carried its familiar tone of condescension as he approached. Look who we have here, the troublemaker and her pet project. Miguel visibly tensed, and Sarah felt her anger flare at Derek's deliberate attempt to humiliate both of them in the hotel lobby. Several other employees were milling around the area, and she was acutely aware that any confrontation would have witnesses. Derek, Sarah said evenly, I hope you're enjoying the evening. Derek smiled, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. Oh, I am. In fact, I'm enjoying it more than I expected. You see, Sarah, I received some very interesting news today about the HR investigation. Sarah felt her stomach clench, but she maintained her composure. I'm sure HR will handle their investigation professionally and fairly. Professional and fair, Derek repeated with a laugh. Yes, I suppose you could call it that. Although I think predictable might be a more accurate description. Derek stepped closer to Sarah, lowering his voice but ensuring that Miguel could hear every word. The investigation has been concluded, and the findings were quite illuminating. It seems that certain employees have a tendency to imagine threats and harassment where none exist. The company takes false accusations very seriously, Sarah. Sarah realized that Derek was telling her the investigation had been decided in his favor, and that she was likely facing disciplinary action or termination. The news was devastating, but not entirely surprising given the power dynamics at play within the company. I stand by everything I reported, Sarah said firmly, regardless of what the investigation concluded. Derek's expression darkened. Your stubbornness is really quite remarkable. Even now, facing the consequences of your poor judgment, you refuse to acknowledge your mistakes. Miguel shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing he could escape the increasingly tense situation. Perhaps we should return to the dinner, he suggested quietly. Derek turned his attention to Miguel, his voice taking on the same cruel tone Sarah remembered from that night in his office. Actually, old man, this concerns you as well. The company has decided that your emotional reaction to routine performance feedback suggests you may not be suitable for continued employment. Sarah's heart sank as she realized that Derek was threatening Miguel's job as part of his retaliation against her. The older man's face went pale, and she could see the fear in his eyes as he processed the implications of Derek's words. Miguel has done nothing wrong, Sarah said, her voice rising slightly despite her efforts to remain calm. His job performance has been exemplary for 15 years. If the company is considering terminating him, it's clearly retaliation for participating in the investigation. Derek laughed again, genuinely amused by Sarah's defiance. Retaliation? No. This is simply good business. We can't have employees who create drama and disrupt the workplace. Both of you have proven that you're not good fits for the Pinnacle culture. Sarah felt the familiar surge of anger that had led her to confront Derek in the first place. She couldn't stand by and watch him destroy Miguel's livelihood as part of his campaign against her. The injustice was too blatant, too cruel to ignore. You're a coward, Sarah said, her voice clear and carrying across the lobby. You use your position to bully and intimidate people who can't fight back. Miguel has more integrity in his little finger than you have in your entire body. Several hotel guests and company employees had stopped to watch the confrontation, creating a small crowd around the three of them. Derek seemed to realize that the situation was escalating beyond his control, and his carefully maintained facade began to crack. How dare you speak to me like that? Derek snarled, stepping aggressively towards Sarah. You have no idea what you've brought on yourself. Sarah stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated by Derek's threatening posture. I know exactly what I'm facing. I'm facing a small, petty man who can't handle being challenged by someone he considers inferior. Derek's face turned red with rage. Inferior? I'll show you inferior. Without warning, Derek grabbed Sarah's arm roughly, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to leave bruises. You need to learn your place, he hissed. The physical assault was exactly what Sarah had been preparing herself for, both mentally and literally. Over the past few weeks, as the tension had escalated, she had been taking self-defense classes at a local martial arts studio. The instructor, a former police officer named Janitor, had taught her that the key to defending against a larger, stronger attacker was to use their aggression against them. Sarah's response was swift and decisive. She twisted her arm in the specific way Janet had taught her, breaking Derek's grip and simultaneously grabbing his wrist. Using his forward momentum and her own leverage, she performed a textbook hip throw that sent Derek crashing to the marble floor of the hotel lobby. The sound of Derek's body hitting the ground echoed through the lobby, followed by a moment of stunned silence from the gathered crowd. Derek lay on his back, momentarily dazed by the unexpected reversal, while Sarah stood over him with her fists still raised in a defensive position. Don't ever put your hands on me again, Sarah said loudly, ensuring that everyone in the lobby could hear her words clearly. The silence was broken by the sound of applause. Miguel was clapping slowly but enthusiastically, a huge smile spreading across his face for the first time in weeks. Other employees began joining in, and soon the entire lobby was filled with the sound of people applauding Sarah's actions. Derek struggled to his feet, his face a mixture of rage and humiliation. His expensive suit was rumpled, and his carefully styled hair was disheveled. More importantly, his reputation as an intimidating figure had been shattered in front of dozens of witnesses. You'll pay for this, Derek said through gritted teeth, but his voice lacked the authority it had carried just minutes earlier. No, said a familiar voice from across the lobby. Patricia Williams approached the group with several other senior executives, her expression stern but satisfied. You'll pay for this, Derek. Derek's face went white as he realized that his assault on Sarah had been witnessed by HR and senior management. This is a misunderstanding, he said desperately. She attacked me. We saw the entire incident, Patricia replied calmly. We were standing right over there when you grabbed Ms. Martinez and threatened her. Her response was clearly self-defense. One of the other executives, a woman Sarah recognized as the vice president of operations, stepped forward. Derek, you're terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises, and you can expect to hear from our legal department about the assault charges. As security officers arrived to escort Derek from the hotel, the crowd in the lobby began to disperse. Many employees approached Sarah to congratulate her and express their support, including several who admitted they had witnessed Derek's bullying behavior in the past but had been afraid to speak up. Miguel approached Sarah with tears in his eyes. Miss Sarah, I don't know how to thank you. You saved my job, and you showed everyone what real courage looks like. Sarah hugged the older man gently. You don't need to thank me, Miguel. We look out for each other. That's what decent people do. Patricia approached them both with a relieved expression. Sarah, I owe you an apology. The investigation was being influenced by Derek's political maneuvering within the company. Tonight's incident has clarified everything for us. Your original complaint was valid, and Derek's behavior tonight confirms the pattern of harassment you reported. Over the following weeks, the atmosphere at Pinnacle Financial Services underwent a dramatic transformation. Derek's termination sent a clear message throughout the company that harassment and intimidation would not be tolerated, regardless of an employee's sales numbers or political connections. Sarah was not only vindicated but also promoted to a senior position within the marketing department, with explicit support from upper management for her integrity and courage. Miguel's job was secure, and he received a commendation for his 15 years of dedicated service. The incident became legendary within the company, with new employees learning about the importance of standing up for what's right through the story of how Sarah Martinez took down Derek Lawson in the hotel lobby. The event marked a turning point in the company culture, establishing a precedent that would protect future employees from similar harassment. 3 months later, Sarah received a letter from Derek's attorney threatening to sue for assault. She forwarded the letter to Pinnacle's legal department, which responded that the company would vigorously defend any employee who acted in self-defense against workplace harassment. The threatened lawsuit never materialized. Sarah often reflected on the events that had transformed her life and career. She had learned that sometimes doing the right thing required taking significant risks, but that the courage to stand up for others ultimately created positive change that extended far beyond the immediate situation. Miguel continued to work at Pinnacle for several more years before retiring with full benefits and the respect of his colleagues. He often told people that Miss Sarah had taught him that dignity was worth fighting for, and that sometimes the most unlikely people could become heroes by simply refusing to accept injustice. The story of Sarah's stand against Derek became more than just office folklore. It became a reminder that in a world where power is often misused, ordinary people have the ability to create extraordinary change through courage, conviction, and the willingness to act when action is needed. Sometimes, taking a stand means more than just speaking up. It means being prepared to back up your words with actions, no matter the consequences.